Today's guest is Anthony Apollo, the Executive Director at the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. We're recording this in person at the Wyoming Blockchain Symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where some of the biggest policymakers in the space have come together to discuss digital assets. The Wyoming Stable Token Commission was established in March of 2023 and has just achieved its first big milestone today, which we will discuss in a moment. Anthony, welcome on.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to Wyoming.
And a very warm welcome. To start off, Anthony, we always like to ask our guests, what does crypto in America mean to you?
I think crypto in America means the ability to innovate. I think we are seeing more of that under the current administration. I'm someone who's been working in this industry for just about 10 years. And it was looking like crypto was leaving America. When you saw, we're talking about stable coins this morning, you saw a lot of that going offshore, particularly the yield-bearing stable tokens like Agora and Mountain going to Bermuda, the Caymans, because we couldn't get the regulatory clarity here in the US. And that put us really at odds with how things have typically been done when we're leaders and innovators. So to me, it all comes down to innovation. And I think we are recapturing that as we speak. And this event's a great example of that.
You guys have some big news today. You issued the first state-issued stablecoin, but state of Wyoming. It's a big deal. I don't think anybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anybody else has done that in the world, right? It's the first government-issued stablecoin?
The first fiat-backed and fully reserved stablecoin issued by a public entity.
Right.
Certainly in the US, to my knowledge, no one else is really working on it. There's always been rumors of perhaps Texas working on a gold-backed one. Whether that's an actual effort or a couple of gold bugs who are pushing the news is a TBD. But we're really the only ones who are working on this, and we were doing this before the current administration came in, before the Genius Act was signed. So this has been years and years of effort. One of the things I'm sure we'll talk about is this is really the culmination of nearly a decade of work within the state of Wyoming to create a robust legislative framework around digital assets, cryptocurrency, and blockchain going back all the way to 2016. But yes, we're the only ones.
Can you explain how it works a little bit?
Sure. So in many ways, it looks similar to the incumbent stablecoins like USDC from Circle, like PYUSD from PayPal, in that when dollars come in and people purchase stable tokens from us, we take those dollars. Some portion of them are held in cash just to make sure we can meet the daily redemptions. But the rest of it is essentially invested by the state in a trust account into very conservative but still interest-bearing instruments. Particularly for us, we're bound by statute. That's, again, cash, U.S. Treasuries with 365 days or less to maturity, U.S. Treasury security repo agreements with 30 days or less to maturity. Very vanilla, very straightforward, but still at this point in time bearing about 4% interest. We look very similar to the reserves of like a Circle or a PayPal in that capacity. But there are a couple of key points of differentiation about how our stable token can be used. I'm sure we'll get more into the depths of it in a little bit, but we're doing the issuance as a sovereign entity, right? We're not setting up a bank, we're not setting up a trust. So this is the state of Wyoming itself doing the issuance of the stable token. And then we're not in this to appease shareholders or to fund, early stage equity from our founders. This is a public goods project for the state of Wyoming. So when those dollars come into the state to buy the stable tokens, they get invested, interest income gets generated on a quarterly basis that gets swept into the state school foundation fund. So this is a way to pay for public initiatives in the state of Wyoming.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that role of the state of Wyoming here, right? Wyoming is obviously like a frontier state. You've been involved in the government here for some time, and obviously that's not culminated, but the most recent achievement, is working on this this commission. We saw Wyoming pass the DAO LLC law years ago. We've seen the DUNA now, and we saw Uniswap finally adopt the DUNA. We've seen this launch of the first stable token. We also see Senator Lummis and all her efforts at the federal level. Why do you think Wyoming has been so oriented towards innovation in digital assets? Is that just part of the DNA of the state, or where does that come from?
It's certainly comes from the DNA of the state, a large part of it, right? The state's always been innovating. We created the LLC before Delaware ran with a better marketing campaign. We were the first state to give women the right to vote. And that's always kind of been embedded in the DNA as the frontier spirit, the pioneer spirit. More tactically, this is also an opportunity for the state to diversify its revenues, not just talking about the stable token itself, but blockchain and digital assets in general, creating frameworks for these things, the DAOs, the DUNAs you pointed out. We have in the Secretary of State's office the ability to register your digital assets on a ledger, pay your tax with crypto. All of this is really meant so that the state can find other ways to generate revenue because Wyoming is such an oil and gas heavy state. And at some point, not in my lifetime, not my grandchildren's lifetime, but when the dinosaur bones dry out, you're going to need some other kind of industry. And if that could be digital assets, then let's work towards that and combine that with the innovative DNA. And here we are.
Some people have also kind of argued that this is like a CBDC in disguise, right? Central bank digital currency. Not everyone's a huge fan of those. So how do you kind of differentiate between that, and what are your response to that?
Well, the quick and easy response is we don't have a money printer, right? So a CBDC to me means someone at the Federal Reserve can just hit a button and mint dollars. Now, we've minted about 25% of USD in the last 5 years with the highly inflationary reaction in the markets. So for us, we don't have that ability. We are fully reserved in that capacity. The second concern that comes up is always the privacy side of things. And one of the points of differentiation for us is we've been very, very clear, we're not trying to exert control over your assets. The amount of information we collect is, not all that significant. We have limitations as a state of what we can collect already. There was a bill that didn't pass in the legislature this last session. Not because of feedback, just because of timing, which I would expect to be back on the docket this upcoming year, but to even further curtail the amount of data that can be collected by a given agency. And beyond that, if you were to look at our terms of service and our user agreements, we essentially say you can use a Wyoming Stable Token for any lawful purpose, right? I'm summarizing a little bit, and we do define, here's the applicable laws, Wyoming law, federal law, your law for whatever jurisdiction you're in. But we don't go through and try to figure out every politically sensitive issue of the moment and have a commission of 7 in the year 2025 come down on that and say, here's our position for however long. Which is, if you look at the terms of service, let's say a Circle or a PayPal, there are those restrictions. So if you look at Circle's terms of service, right, you can't buy firearms. Now you could always get into the conversation about, ownership versus purchase, but, that could have a chilling effect, and we're a state that could become a Second Amendment concern. But more importantly than that, it's the seizure element. Mm-hmm. So if we were to kind of exert control and just start freezing or seizing people's funds, that could be a Fourth Amendment concern. So we were very specific to define what we could do with a temporary legal order, a permanent or final legal directive, only then if a entity, some kind of regulatory body with enforcement powers and has jurisdiction over the state of Wyoming tells us to do some kind of freeze or seize, we will do it. Beyond that, we're hands off. And that's all in code as well as in policy and rule.
Mm-hmm. Now there's a caveat here. The token was supposed to be available to the public today in its public launch. It's not. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
I could tell you a little bit, indeed.
Or a lot.
There are some regulatory concerns. They are firmly out of the state of Wyoming's hands. Mm-hmm. It is not lost on myself or the team or our commissioners that this is a TradFi problem affecting a digital asset program. I am not at liberty to say much. I am but the executive director. I'm a humble emissary for the commission. And I do believe when our chairman, Governor Mark Gordon, is on stage on Wednesday, he may have more to say about all of this. Our hands are a little tied, but we look at this as kind of a temporary setback. We are looking at today as a pretty big step in the right direction from a technical standpoint. Mm-hmm. I don't know any other states or public entities in the US that have, verified smart contracts on 7 different blockchains that are interoperable, that people can start looking at, understanding, picking apart, giving us feedback on. Mm-hmm. We're still way ahead by years of any other public body doing this kind of work.
I don't know if you all have noticed this recently, but Avalanche has been on a roll. From FIFA launching their own Layer 1 on Avalanche, to VanEck unveiling the purpose-built fund to back ecosystem projects, the world is watching and building on Avalanche. Web3 gaming? Avalanche-based titles like MapleStory and Off the Grid have it covered. Finance? Avalanche has got that down pat too. Entertainment? Built for that as well. On top of that, starting in 2026, Sports Illustrated Stadium will be the first major sports venue to fully adopt blockchain ticketing powered by Avalanche. Backed by a strong network of builders and dedicated community, the momentum is accelerating on Avalanche for games, music, sports, finance, and more. Want to see how Avalanche is driving adoption? Go to avax.network and check it out.
Yeah, I want to ask, I think when people do get it in their hands, obviously that's fantastic. And, there will, I'm sure, be a lot of adoption and work on just the technical integration of the token across all the applications you guys are looking at in Wyoming. But you mentioned something important that I think gets under discussed in terms of the broader crypto conversation or digital asset conversation, which is this Fourth Amendment sort of unlawful search or seizure kind of aspect that seems to affect digital assets pretty significantly and has come up a lot in terms of like self-custody and some of these other things. Do you envision the Wyoming Stable Token embracing kind of like a self-custody aspect, or how do you deal with sort of the privacy and property rights of individuals with the overarching sort of goals of a sovereign when it comes to things like custody and transfer? You touched on some of it, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, Wyoming has a pretty hands-off attitude to many things. And I would say that ethos still applies to the Wyoming Stable Token. We're not really looking to, whether you're custodying on a exchange, whether you're self-custodying, it's really kind of, again, if it's lawful activity, it's not going to raise an eyebrow here. That being said, I'm not looking to make this sound like it is the Wild West, despite the fact that we are in the Wild West. We still, are engaging on-chain analytics providers, open source intelligence. We do have a higher reputational risk than a private issuer. So we need to make sure that Wyoming stable tokens are not being used for nefarious purposes, or not being used by, in North Korea. So we have all the monitoring in place to make sure those controls are there. Again, there's no perfect solution to these things. You can never make guarantees, but I feel fairly confident that we're doing a lot of risk mitigation along the way towards that end.
Mm-hmm. Something cool about the FRNT token is that it actually operates outside the parameters of the Genius Act, the federal stablecoin bill that was just passed a couple of weeks ago. Can you explain why that is? And also the cool thing about it, at least I think that's cool about it, is that it may open the door to offer yield at some point in the future, which is obviously exciting for issuers and also users of the stable token. Is that something that you envision a use case for FRNT in the future?
Absolutely. So if you look at the Genius Act as well as the Stable Act when that was still kind of on the floor, issuers are defined by person or persons in those documents. If you look at the definition of persons, it's banks, it's trusts, it's fintechs. Nowhere in there does it say state issuer of a stablecoin. If you consider how the Genius Act is structured, if we were to hit a certain threshold of stable, like a market cap, we'd have to convert to a bank or a trust structure, and that's not going to fly for a sovereign entity. So we're kind of outside the scope of all of that. And, Senator Lummis obviously has been very close to the Genius Act, as well as the revived Responsible Financial Innovation Act in the House as in the Senate as the market structure bill. So that's exciting. But we've had her policy aide, Chris Land, who's general counsel, as well as the staff director for the Senate Banking Subcommittee on Digital Assets, came and testified at the prior meeting of the Select Committee on Blockchain, which is the branch of the Wyoming State Legislature that oversees the commission, and just kind of verbatim said, there's no expectation the Genius Act is going to apply to the Wyoming Stable Token, the commission, or the product. Mm-hmm. Now, we're still bound by statute, so everything that is a Wyoming Stable Token has to be reserved one-to-one, have a certain basket of permitted investments. But from my perspective, speaking personally, there's nothing precluding us from doing a yield-bearing stable token as a state, using some of the exemptions afforded to states under securities laws, like municipal bonds. Mm. If we were to be able to get that off the ground, and we're certainly looking into that, we would be the only domestic yield-bearing stable coin available to non-accredited investors. Because as I said a little earlier, we've seen a lot of that activity go offshore with Mountain and Agora. We've certainly seen yield-bearing stable tokens through Buildle and other funds. If you have $5 million to sink into stable coins, to get some yield on it. But really, as I said before, I've been in this industry for about 10 years. You always hear about banking the unbanked. If we're actually able to get a stable coin out that could bear some kind of yield for anyone, not only Americans, but anyone globally, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, probably spark a statewide run on people trying to catch up to you, right?
Well, I would hope, and some of the conversations we may have here along the way, is that other states will look to adopt a Wyoming stable token. It's big news. Everyone's hearing about it now, but this has again been years and years and years of work behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So for another state to even copy and paste what we've done through one or more legislative sessions to get the buy-in from industry and the state, to then go through a procurement process to get all the vendors on board, get set up, build, and deploy, you might as well just use a Wyoming stable token and wait 3 to 5 years, right? So I think one of the things we'll start looking at in more depth now is interstate compacts with other states to say, we've already got laws, rules, policies, tech, team. Do you want in on this? We could figure out some kind of perhaps revenue share model with other states and start getting state balance sheets on Wyoming stable tokens, which then gets into all the use cases we've been talking about recently, where can we use Wyoming stable tokens to make government operations more efficient? And one of the demos we did recently was with a team called Hashfire, run by a gentleman named John Belitsky. They do automation of contracts, business contracts, kind of like DocuSign does. And they also automatically effectuate the payments using stablecoins. So we did a demo of that at one of our commission meetings recently, where we took a pay cycle from a 45-day statutory limit to about 45 seconds, right? And when people see that, they start understanding the implications of that even I'm not thinking of, right? For example, there was a write-up in one of the state papers about the ability to use this to give aid to first responders. And we've had, this time last year, we had about 850,000 acres burned between northern Wyoming and Montana. So being able to get first responders or volunteers in, get them paid, get them supplies, lease equipment, all that needs to happen. If there's a way to do that instantaneously with the stable token, we're certainly looking very heavily into those types of use cases.
Wow.
Anthony, so is the goal really to get all these states to adopt the Wyoming token opposed to 50 state-led tokens?
Just borrow our homework rather than replicate the process.
I think that would be the maneuver. I mean, I'm a little biased, of course, because I'm a little closer to them, but I just think, I personally wouldn't want to see 50 states having 50 tokens. And again, if it's all interoperable at the end of the day,
the interoperability problems.
right? But if it's all interoperable
Yeah.
out the gate, it probably means we're using the same or almost the same smart contracts. Why not just use the same? And again, if there's a revenue share component that a state can get that income, but not to deal with the expenses of running a program. And to be clear, we are not an expensive program. We're 5 people. But having that efficiency, I think, would be impactful to them.
Yeah.
What would you say this token is kind of made for? Like, who is the average buyer or the person that you would imagine using this?
Well, hopefully it's for everybody, right? It's for institutional uses. If you want to move big blocks of functionally something that looks a lot like a proxy for a dollar around quite quickly. International settlement. One of the interesting things about doing this as a sovereign entity is we will enter the federal government, but we're not under the purview of, let's say, MiCA in the EU or the Japan Financial Services Authority. They don't have authority over us. So if we wanted to go across borders, we don't have the headache, let's say Circle does, where they have to set up 16 offices all around the world and figure out the jurisdictional outlay of every single geo they want to operate in. So it could be domestic, international, it could be for institutional, retail as well. We did announce that we are going to be partnering with Rain on Avalanche to use their smart cards to essentially use stablecoins, Wyoming stablecoins, stable tokens, anywhere that you can swipe your Visa card. So you're already embedded with 150 million merchants. You're already on Apple Pay. You're already on Google Pay. So the retail use case is there as well. And then the last note I'll say is we, perhaps unsurprisingly, have a lot of interest from other government bodies, as well as NGOs and other kind of nonprofits who, in the wake of USAID being taken apart, still want to maximize the soft power of the dollar, still want to do aid distribution, but want to do it in a way where there's not so many intermediaries between the entity doing the funding and the recipient of that funding. So now we know that 88% of every dollar was vaporized along the way. So if you go from point A to point B with not only that direct payment and make it peer-to-peer, but also with finality in the range of a couple of seconds and fees that could be less than a penny, makes a whole ton of sense.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that infrastructure, the homework you guys did, right, on the rails. You just talked about 2 of the partners you're working with and the launch of this initial token being associated with Avalanche. You guys went through a pretty big diligence process. Say was obviously one of the finalists and a latecomer to that process. Do you guys see a need for multiple chains to be supported in order to kind of meet that interoperability need or all the applications you're looking at?
Well, I think for us, it comes down to a couple of things. One is as a state, we're not in the business of really picking winners. Now, in any kind of procurement process, definitionally, you have to pick a winner. But that's why before we even started the RFQs and RFPs to pick vendors for the build out, the reserves management, we did a very robust blockchain selection exercise, made it kind of open source. Here's a number of chains, here's 25 to 30 criteria. 5 or 6 would be binary. You have to pass these. You need to have these features, or really it's kind of a non-starter for us. And then we'll score you on the rest if you get beyond that. And that's why we didn't, just take the high score and say, okay, this one. We wanted to have a handful. And, we said, when we went to the procurement piece, we said, well, you need to be building on one of these 7 chains. And then it just so happened that Layer 0 was selected as the token issuer. Interoperability, candidly, was not a big part of the procurement piece. It was kind of like a nice to have. Just ended up being that the rest of the proposal was so strong that we went that direction. And now we're on all 7 of the chains that we had initially. We also have a remit from the state legislature to be multi-chain technology agnostic. So we will continue this process. We do the blockchain selection on a quarterly basis and keep rolling it forward. And then as the tech kind of expands, the expectation is we bring more chains on. Say is also one of our candidate blockchains, along with Aptos, Stellar, Sui. So we'll start there. But then I've got a lot of interest in also figuring out what we could do with the UTXO ecosystem. It's much more difficult, doesn't have as much stablecoin adoption at this point in time. But as a state that has a senator talking about a Bitcoin reserve and all of that at the federal level, and also as a state that, you have the ability to cap gas flares to mine Bitcoin, it makes sense to kind of get into that realm a little bit. Now, that's gonna be a whole parallel procurement process and take a whole lot of time. We'll get there eventually, but I'd like to see if there's a couple teams building that are closer to the pin on where we are now. And then the last thing I'll say, which is kind of the obvious one, is you don't want that much fragmented liquidity. Having that interoperability is gonna help scale us from day one, rather than trying to go piece by piece by piece and just kind of tacking it together.
Bitcoin might sound complicated, but the Gemini credit card makes it simple. Use it like any credit card. Buy lunch, gas, or your weekly groceries, and you'll earn up to 4% back instantly in Bitcoin or one of over 50 other cryptos straight to your account. No annual fee, and right now you can grab a $200 Bitcoin intro bonus. It's the easiest way to start building your Bitcoin stash. Go to gemini.com/CIA to learn more. Terms apply. Cardano founder Charles Hoskinson actually came out and criticized you guys for having a lack of transparency and perhaps a bias when it came to choosing those 7 chains. What do you say to that?
Candidly, I think it's just wrong. I mean, the entire thing was built in public. His big concern, this is his public statements, not mine, is that they had the ability to do freeze and seize, which again, we talked about. We need that to make sure we're remaining compliant and that nefarious actors aren't using Wyoming stable tokens. His firm sent us a letter saying they didn't have the capabilities. So we moved on with that. Then we got to the end of the entire procurement process. They did a demonstration at the University of Wyoming that demonstrated that capacity. Because along the way, we said we need existing and demonstrable capabilities. We're not looking to build anything net new. We're a state, we're a team of 5. That's not really our specialty. We just need to bolt this together around a very specific regulatory framework and carve out. So Cardano is back in the mix, right? They were able to get that feature. So they're now judged based on that, and we'll move over from there. And they're going to stay in the mix until further notice. Got
it. You walk us through the AML, KYC features. How do you plan on combating illicit finance if there were any to take place, I guess, on the blockchains?
Sure. So one thing I should mention, just a differentiation point that I probably glossed over before, is we as an agency are not doing today like direct issuance to an end user. That's not the goal, even when we go live and are publicly available. Our position is we'll be working with what we call licensed service providers, or LSPs. That's your big exchanges. We mentioned Kraken in the press release today. Potentially wallets, potentially mobile applications, payment platforms, what have you. We're onboarding them through a very robust KYB process, and then we'll rely on them to be purchasers of the Wyoming Stable Token and then resell it on to the end user who they've already KYC'd and done the AML over. Beyond that, we of course have our own regime. We mentioned before, on-chain analytics. We mentioned open source intelligence from Inco, putting all those models together. And we've got, as our Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, Deborah Brooks, who was formerly the Deputy Virtual Currency Chief and Head of Supervision at the New York Department of Financial Services. Yeah. So she's certainly well aware of how all this operates and is putting together the whole kind of AML framework. So I'm sure that'll be, if not a public document, publicly available, going forward.
I think another question I had is kind of on the front of the availability of this when it comes to like local communities, right? Have you integrated or had conversations starting with like state level banks, credit unions, so on and so forth? And what is their response so far? Are they interested, or they're like, nah, maybe next time?
Well, again, this is all public information. We've had a lot of pushback from the Bankers Association in the state of Wyoming. When I got the role, I kind of went there with an olive branch and said, here's who I am. I come from a TradFi background before I was in the blockchain side of things, so I kind of understand what you're up against. How could we partner on this? And that was pretty tough to do in the prior administration because every time you turned around, there's some new blocker or some new example to point to about digital assets not being adopted. And then they just didn't want to take on more risk, or they didn't want to do the work to figure out X, Y, and Z, which, that's their prerogative. So they've started to come around now that some of the guidance from the Fed or from the OCC has been rescinded. Their appetite's kind of increasing. The credit unions, at least in Wyoming, have been much more amenable to all this. It's interesting because up until the last legislative session, credit unions in Wyoming were not able to take public funds. Now, we're not really public funds because we're holding, the dollars in trust on behalf of the end user, the token holder, but it was kind of murky and there was some trepidation there. Now that there's more clarity on that in the state, we are having a whole roundtable next Friday with the CEOs of all the credit unions in the state to figure out how they can get involved and go through some of the examples and of, things like tokenized deposits and getting into that. We're not doing tokenized deposits, obviously, but people who could wrap Wyoming stable tokens to that effect and accomplish that. We're going to start all those conversations in a more formal manner very soon.
Yeah, I wanted to tap into that too. Another question I had is like on the front of tokenizing real world assets and commodities or real estate and so on and so forth. Are there interests there from the commission or more so just people in the industry that would like to do it?
Well, so for the commission, we're very targeted, right? It's the Stable Token Commission for now. That's our remit. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we answer and are overseen by the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Innovation, and Digital Innovation Technology, which may, at some point, hopefully in the near future, be renamed the Blockchain and Emerging Technology for a little shorter title there. But they're now starting to look into real-world assets because Wyoming as a state is so rich in oil and gas, land and livestock, gold and silver, rare earths. We opened the first rare earth mine in 70 years in the U.S. about 2 weeks ago. And we are also the #1 state for uranium deposits. So if people start thinking about growing energy needs with AI and other things, you need small-scale nuclear reactors. Well, how do we get all that stuff? It's uranium, possibly on state lands in the state of Wyoming. So there's a lot of interest in digging into that. Obviously, it's a pretty complex topic. Are we going? Because every time you need to get a new asset in the RWA bucket, it's going to look a little different. I've got a pretty good idea how to tokenize gold. I've talked to a team with, at Paxos about that several years back. They've got that model. That's, custodying uranium is going to look a lot different, right? So I think there's a lot of excitement, but it's going to take some time and measured thought to get there. But also we're the state that's done that for the last 10 years. So why not go ahead and start that process?
I want to go back to the concept of how this works with banks, how the credit unions are feeling about this, and sort of the broader kind of connective tissue within the system that stablecoins, I think, are going to come to kind of dominate over the next decade or so. We had Caitlin Long from Custody on the show. She's obviously been a big proponent of innovative finance and in Wyoming for several years. And she was somewhat critical, I think, of like this initiative. She's had her own battles. You would think that, with the bank associations, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I don't know how that relationship is evolving. And then also we're talking today on the day that Bo Hines announced that he's becoming a strategic advisor for Tether. So another private issuer that's going to do a lot in the United States. How do you guys, you've talked a lot about the state specific and I think the sovereign specific use cases. How do you see this, I guess, working within the rest of this kind of ecosystem that's going to develop on both the public and private side kind of over the next decade or so?
Yeah, I think, if you think about where we are right now, we've got about $270 billion, maybe a little more, in stablecoins issued. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, says we're going to 3.7 trillion, right? So if we're going to over 10x the entire size of the industry, there's room for a number of players here in different flavors. I think Tether will still predominantly be working overseas. I think Circle will certainly firm up its dominance here, although, I think you probably saw some of the numbers about revenues versus expenses on their side. Interest rates will throw the whole thing into I guess, a little bit of a fracas, right? If you go from a 4% interest rate where everyone's making good money on the underlying reserves, and we all of a sudden drop to 0.5% or 1%, it's going to really cut into margins and make people, think about things a lot differently. Again, I would say that we are getting a lot of inbound interest from other public entities that perhaps don't want to, or trepidation about working with companies that have or even public companies that have a definitional directive to appease their shareholders, right? we're a public goods project, and there's a lot more camaraderie around that with these government entities. So if that becomes our carve out, and everyone else in the private issuers are working with the big banks, then so be it. Then there's enough room for everybody. I don't know how it'll play out. I don't think any of us know how it's really going to play out. But I think you'll see the momentum that my personal perspective is the momentum that we currently have will probably stick around for a little bit. But I think when interest rates start to change, we're going to see a flux.
So yeah, Anthony, thank you for braving the elements out here. No bears, no moose.
In the Wild
I've seen
West.
both of them on the way here, brother.
Yeah. It looks like that sprinkler is rotating, so we're going to have to probably wrap up here quick. But what would you say to other states who are looking at adopting a program like Wyoming's, like some of the pitfalls you've taken away, or some of the risks that you could run kind of putting that together?
Sure. I think the main takeaway is this technology is not scary. It's like every other tool. It could be used for good, it could be used for bad. When I first started this role, we had people showing up to present public comment during our regular meetings, which is part of the public process, making statements like every dollar that we were going to put into this was going to fund Hamas, right? So then we had to bring in Ari over at TRM Labs, say we've assessed this. 0.68% of all transactions are possibly illicit, right, on chain. And then we also said 50% of those are on Tron, so we cut that out of our blockchain selection process. So it's all just, educating yourself and making informed decisions. I've also been in positions where when I had to get in front of our joint appropriations committee and secure the budget so we could take this from a one-man agency that it was for a year to actually bring some resources on, I got questions like, where are we going to be smelting and vaulting the Wyoming stable tokens? So it's a process that people have to be educated on. I think blockchain is a little trickier because finance is involved right out the gate. No one cares what POP3 is when you send an email. No one cares about what TCP/IP is when you go to a website. But once it's your assets and your money moving around, people want to understand this down to the consensus level. Mm-hmm. So just working with people to make sure they can get that far. And then just treating it like any other tool. Will it make operations in your state more efficient? Will it help you preserve or generate new income sources to lower the tax burdens on your citizens? If you look at it from that perspective and kind of take a step back, and just kind of look at it as a tool in your arsenal, I think that's much more helpful than worrying about whether, everything that's on a blockchain is a scam.
Mm-hmm. Last thing, Anthony, obviously you guys have done a ton of work on this over the past few years, but this is almost like a starting point too, right? So what's next for the commission? What are you guys focusing on now? Getting it out there, launching to the public?
The public launch will be big. That will be obviously the big next step. And, now that we have a number of different chains that are live, we announced, the Rain integration on Avalanche. We announced Kraken and Solana. The hope would be by the time we actually get this thing rolling, we're on all 7 chains with a couple of partners and a couple of high-profile use cases. We're going to still continue the pilot program we've been working on, and then just scale the thing. And I think getting in front of other states and getting interstate compacts potentially off the ground could be helpful with that, and just roll it from there.
Amazing. Awesome. Anthony?
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy your time in Wyoming.
Yeah, thanks
for having us in your state.
You're welcome.
Cool.